I am a creative practitioner and cultural researcher based between Singapore and London. My practice is guided by the iterations of slow violence and the dynamic between the near and elsewhere. In attempting to disarm instruments of knowledge production, my practice shies away from reduction and completion. And with my practice, I try to stay away from essentialisms, and my interests lie with once forgotten micro and muted narratives. So, by re envisioning fractured traditions, I engage with visual and textual interventions to navigate the nuances of perception and retention. My work situates itself in the slippery spaces of the between, where things intermingle and coexist, without necessarily bleeding into or consuming each other. In my practice of soft histories, I look toward the possibilities of embodiment, native cosmologies, and countering violence through tuning into healing traditions. As an extension to my practice, I run Sing, a research and curatorial platform centered on the poetics and politics of Southeast Asian artistic practices. The platform is a domain of not yet possibilities, with projects taking shape in various forms. And most recently, I co-curated an online screening titled Nameless Echo Spectres Hisses, which explored the relationship between sound and place in the context of Southeast Asia. The screening featured the works of Debussy, 62, Benjamin Taussig, Pathamon, Mont Tespratip, Russell Morton, Shirwana Spong, and Sung Tiu. I'll be focusing on a specific body of work in this talk, which is the unusual powers of disposing. And with this work, I attempt to illustrate the movement of a natural resource, which is the tricalcium phosphate on Christmas Island. And the project was also guided by the iterations of thinker Rob Nixon's notion of slow violence. And as the prime natural resource of the island, it was harvested back in the day of the British rule, and phosphate mining began there in 1899 using indentured labor from Singapore, Malaya, and China. And it still exists today under the name of Christmas Island Phosphate Company. And the resource was and still is used in everyday objects. So you have it in toothpaste, porcelain, baby powder, baking products. And the project was trying to inform viewers of this seemingly invisible yet omnipresent ecological violence, unveiling the connection between the grand and the mundane. So what comes forth, I hope, with the project was neither a spectacular nor an instantaneous mirage of what natural resource farming and extractive mining activities is, but instead a force that is incremental and it's slow. And I will share the video with you.
Christmas Island Phosphates is part of a long mining tradition in the Indian Ocean territories. For over 20 years, we've been a reliable supplier of phosphate products graded to our customers' specifications. Our geographical position offers us a rapid turnaround time on deliveries to Indonesia, Malaysia, New Zealand, and Australia. CIP provides all mining services in-house, from mining and haulage to on-site lab testing, robotic loading and packaging, and finally to shipping. We have a highly skilled, multicultural, island-based workforce that ensures our operation maintains the production rates to meet any client's supply requests. Our workforce comprises a large percentage of the local population. And we embrace our social and environmental responsibilities to contribute to the Christmas Island community through numerous cultural, religious and sporting events, thereby building a community that we are actively a part of. As well as our social responsibility, our environmental responsibility is equally as important. We proudly offer many contributions to the preservation of the unique ecosystem that makes up the island's natural environment. Christmas Island phosphates will continue to be part of the fabric of Christmas Island well into the future. We will continue to provide a quality service to our customers, as well as enrich the local community and environment that we call home.
So that was the moving image that forms part of the installation, The Unusual Powers of Disposing. And this was a satirical film combining archival photographs and documents from the National Archives in Kew in the UK with a more recent corporate video of the Christmas Island Resources Phosphate Company. And currently with the CIRP continuing its mining activities on the island, the corals around Christmas Island is still being washed and still being degraded on its offshore reef. And the hard-coded subtitles that you see in the video are direct line references of the Memorandum on Colonial Mining Policy that was from the National Archives of Kew. And this acted as a rule of thumb in which the British Empire referenced when they were carrying out their extraction activities in its dominions. So running in a similar vein to the undersea and cloud-based networks that exist between spaces, for my proposal for the Tauan residency projects, I wanted to focus on a virtual countermapping to the relational aesthetics of the island. The work is guided by two entities, one, the red crabs, and two, my lost great-grandfather, who was a former colonial magistrate on Christmas Island, who you see on the right side of the slide. And the proposed work for the Tauan residency will be an extension and expansion of the video that I've just shown you. The second iteration that I will be working on in this residency will look to the ancestral bloodlines that governs the crabs and also myself in relation to my great-grandfather. And I'm also interested in this idea of combining archival material and written text on the marine and bioanthropology of the island. And the piece seeks to display this kind of ambivalence of blood and its materiality on kinship. So bringing together what it is as a sensorium of Christmas Island and a counter mapping, the work proposes to sense the island intentionally and also ironically through the digital means of a virtual map. And in reverence to the crab flows with their migration every year and my so-called deficient ancestral connection, blood is used as a tool of navigation on the map. So here you have what is meant to be a proposed coordinates of my great-grandfather and his locations throughout his lifetime as a magistrate. So he started out in Singapore and then he left to Christmas Island and he ended up in Hong Kong during World War II where he died. And looking at the map, I've proposed this shapely imprint of his wanderings and also the areas in which he occupied in the ocean. starting from Singapore to Christmas Island and finally in Hong Kong. And with this visual, this is another means of me trying to chart out how oral history might look when it's mapped against traditional cartographic means. So this was a conversation that I had with my uncle, who was telling me the stories of what he remembers to be my great-grandfather and where he has been. And based on our recording and our conversation, I looked at the audio waves and the forms, and I tried to map it out in a shapely imprint, trying to see how that might look when it's played out on a map. And as for counter mapping, the work is intent on this idea of liquefying demarcation lines and boundaries. It is also interested in this dissipation of the history of violent cartography, especially liquidating existing models that will take place through this new model of a counter map. So here is an example of a brand that uses a map, but also users are able to toggle over each option, and they would have a bit of history that pops up in relation to where they are clicking on the map. So bearing symbols and codexes, the counter map will also offer the user a deeper dive into the politics and the poetics of Christmas Island and its locality. So for example, when a symbol is clicked on, an artifact or an audio clip will emerge, revealing more of the imagined life of Lim Teck Lai, which is my great-grandfather, or the background of the red crab migration. And the interface will show or remove ghost nuggets, including documents and memorabilia related to Lim Teck Lai and the red crabs. It's also used as a tool of resistance, but also a coping mechanism, where the counter map proposes an antidote to the Plan A, which in reference would be the mainland, presenting possibilities of rekindling lost ancestral bloodlines and crustacean life. So finding definition and understanding of the island via native cosmologies and folk traditions, the work looks towards engaging in an erotics of the island. So borrowing from forms of visual language and specifically visual erotica as suggested by the humans and the Anthropocene's island fetish, a landscape countering this idea of island porn comes into the picture as an aesthetic. So this piece that I hope to build, which is the counter map, will borrow visual cues from that generation of island philia and this erotics of tropicality, which is a very ubiquitous trope in culture. This idea of islands and island life in with stock imagery in Getty Images that infiltrates the everyday. And also another aspect of sonic erotica will also function as a medium of mapping, and this will be heard through the archival sounds of crabs scurrying to their mating spot, sound bites from its human neighbors set against an environmental and quotidian soundscape. So to sum up, I would like to revisit the four main themes that will govern the work. And the first theme would be cartography. So how can the project challenge pre-existing and often violent prescriptions of knowledge production and inscription? So for example, you have classical notions of cartography and ways of mapping the world, ways of drawing the global south versus the global north, that is typically Western and Enlightenmentist. And how can also cartography be a way in which that the project can expand out of this Google gaze that prescribes a geo-essentialism, and how can the project seek for a less prescriptive way of mapping the world and moving around the world, and how can it facilitate a more compassionate sense of illustrating the landscape and its residents, human and non-human. The second theme would be this enlisting of an inter versus intra methodology, as with the theme movement. So it's this idea of departing from the classic dynamic of the mainland versus the island, the center versus the periphery. And movement is also embedded in this idea of ancestral roots that are forged by environmental and cyclical effects in two parallel veins. So first you have the yearly red crab migration on Christmas Island, and second you have the jurisdictional immigration and movement by my great-grandfather, who again was a colonial magistrate of the island. And hopefully the countermap will be facilitated through this porous and mutable space that is Christmas Island. And the third theme would be space. So I hope that the project will be able to address questions and problems of this non-ownership of space on Christmas Island. On Christmas Island, they have a law which is a non-native law, and this dictates the island's governance, where there is no native to the space, because this island is built, its population is built by essentially immigrants throughout the course of history. And also another point would be this borderless and decentralized flow of islandic movements through the terrestrial but also the marine space of Christmas Island. The life tempo of human residents on the island has been historically governed by the migration of the red crabs, and this is something that the countermap seeks to explore. How is human space negotiated by the non-human? And the last theme would be sensorium. So the countermap that I am working on developing would be something that can provide a sensuality of a space that hints to an island intimacy, and how humans can engage with not just nature but also the non-human and the non-animal. And it's this idea of shedding light on the everyday movements, but also the temporalities of embodied knowledge of the natives. So like I said earlier, it is how the natives, they have their life and the tempo of their everyday governed by the red crabs during the migration season. And also the countermap would play host to the undocumented senses and feelings, and it's an ode really to this idea of Islandic and indigenous know-how of how soft histories can be a methodology for approaching sustainability and conservation, but also how honoring their soft histories, as well as this trope of mythologizing ancestry through my great-grandfather.